The Economist. Well, what do you want to have more? Please welcome Bruce Schneier.
This is not my dessert. And it's not my jacket. And this is not my t-shirt. And those are not my slides. But this is my Coke. It's your jacket. Even better. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to see so many people here engaged in this issue. It seems like pretty much everybody is trying to host events on this topic. I might have gotten a couple of dozen invites. So I think this is important. I like that we're talking about it. I like that we're trying to come up with solutions. I'm not disheartened that there aren't easy answers. This is actually a fundamentally hard problem. And I want to talk about the more general problem, because I think that's sort of more interesting than Snowden and the NSA, sort of what we're doing here on the internet, and what society looks like, and how we are going to make privacy work in the coming century. It's not at all obvious how we're going to do this, but I think it's essential that as society, I mean, not as Europe, not as the United States, not as the US government, as society, as human civilization, that we figure out how to solve this problem. And that's really what I want to sort of try to get to today. Right, so let's think about the threats to privacy. And I have a list of them. And the list is not going to be news to anyone here. But I think it's still worth going through them to sort of hear how robust this problem is. Right, we're talking a lot here about surveillance technologies. We're talking about internet surveillance. Right? We're talking about conversations, emails, SMSs. We're talking about transactions, banking, commerce. Talking about different things we might look at. So looking at various websites, news articles. And that's the fodder of what's here. This is one thing. Right? Video surveillance has been in the news recently. In two different ways, right? CCTV, actually three ways. CCTV and drones, and then Google Glass, right? Internet-enabled video surveillance. Tom was talking about audio surveillance, like phone calls, not collecting metadata, but collecting conversations. Cell phone surveillance, not just the calls and the messages, but location data and other things associated with your little handheld computers. GPS, RFID, we've seen Wi-Fi surveillance, Bluetooth surveillance. There's a lot going on. And mirror this with different identification technologies. On the internet, that's relatively easy. A lot of sites you're signing in. And we would know that even if you're signing with an alias, there's a lot of ways to tie identity together. But lots of embedded identification codes and things we use. Digital cameras, color printers, photocopy machines, automatic face recognition. We heard about Spain, automatic voice recognition. And certainly that's being done elsewhere. Different databases of identification. I mean, it's intriguing that Facebook has the world's largest collection of open identified photographs of people. It's simply through all of us tagging photos of all of us. Right, lots of data collection technologies out there. I mean, again, we talk about the internet. Credit cards are an enormous data collection technology. Right, this guy with a camera. Right. In the United States, we have a lot of affinity cards. And you go into a lot of merchants will tie your purchases to an affinity card, giving you discounts in exchange for knowing who you are and what you've purchased. Right, collection from every computer process. Consolidation. In the United States especially, there's a huge data broker industry where this information is consolidated, collected, bought, and sold. And associated lots of data mining technologies. Right? We heard a couple days ago about the NSA mining social networking data. But they're actually a latecomer to this. Right? Google and Facebook and others have been doing this since they were invented. But even before then, data brokers like ChoicePoint have been doing this. I mean, big data means everything gets analyzed. And we're seeing a lot of crossover between government and commercial databases. And so that's the breadth of what we're looking at. So what are the trends here? And I think the trends are important because they sort of point to what is happening relatively naturally. So first I want to look at the technological trends. Fundamentally, data is a byproduct of the information society. Right? Everything that's done on a computer creates a transaction record, right? Naturally. It's what computers do. Right? So your cell phone, just by its existence, creates records. Call records, SMS records, location records. Right? The new iPhone with the really impressive motion sensor will know when you're awake and when you're asleep, when you're holding it, when you're not, ambient light in the room. Right? Browsing the internet creates records. Any kind of commerce. Right? Both credit cards, affinity cards, pretty much anything that doesn't involve cash, which is pretty much everything. And even something as simple as road toll collection. Right? In the United States, 20 years ago, you dropped a quarter into a toll booth. Now we have something called Easy Pass in most of the Northeast, and a transaction record is created, when and where you were. Right? So everything just produces that data. And data is a byproduct of pretty much all of our socialization now, because all of our socialization now is mediated by computers, with the exception of rare things like us in this room. When I want to talk to my wife, we talk on email, even if we're in the same house, because it's easier. Right? She's upstairs, I'm downstairs. Right? But that's true for most of us at work. We talk to our friends, we talk to our colleagues, we talk via computers. We're on social networking sites. Right? All of those create transaction records. And the information society has caused this enormous sea change in the world of personal data. Right? Moore's law is the friend of intrusion here. The data is increasingly stored and increasingly searchable. Right? As data storage drops to free, as data processing drops to free, the marginal value a company needs to store this approaches zero. You all remember, I remember the moment when you stopped editing your email and started storing it all because it was easier. Right? There was a moment when sort became more expensive than search. And we're all of the age that we remember that moment. For kids these days, sort is increasingly irrelevant. Why even bother? Because search is so efficient. Right? So what's happening is we are all leaving digital footprints wherever we go. And this is not a question of malice on anyone's part. This is how computers work. Right? It's additional work not to. Naturally, you just leave these footprints. Right? And as Casper talked about, wherever he went, there he is, cloud computing exacerbates this. And with cloud computing, we're leaving those footprints on other people's computers. Remember the definition of cloud computing, the only one that really matters. Your data on someone else's hard drive. Right? That's what it is. Right? So now all of these footprints you're losing control over because data and computation are being done remotely. And that's just the way technology works today. And probably the cloud is the end game. Because computing has always been this balance between the cost of computation and the cost of data transport. And cloud represents both of those costs dropping to free. So it makes sense to put your computation in the place where the life cycle cost, the maintenance cost is the lowest, and just access it from wherever you are. There's no cost cheaper than free. So likely this is the end. That increasingly we're going to have our data where it makes technological sense. And that's going to be on someone else's machine. Because otherwise, it's too expensive for me to handle my own maintenance. All right, so what are the legal trends here? So the usability of this data from a very general perspective depends on local laws. In general, there has been a sort of vague libertarian bent to the internet. Right? Laws shouldn't mess with technology. That's sort of the way people think. And this leads us to, at least in the United States, that most of my information isn't really owned by me. Right? It's owned by the people who have it. Right? Email services like Gmail, phone records at my phone company, the data brokers like ChoicePoint. Right? So most corporations, there's not a lot of law protecting what they can do. Different in Europe, which I like. And again, we're seeing today, national intelligence is exempt from a lot of these laws. Right? And they operate in this increasingly large gray area. It's a great quote by General Hayden, who used to run the NSA, where he talked about, and what did he say? He said something like, give me the box to operate in, and I will go to the very edges of that box. And he'll say he'll push the edges. I mean, he'll go right to the edge. And actually, I believe him. What's happening is technology increasingly grows the box. So you've got the box, and there are laws regulating the box. The box gets bigger, there are no laws. And the NSA is going to rush out to the edges of the box, so they will move faster than laws can. And you can argue that that's just them doing, and they'll argue that this is them doing their job. Why shouldn't they do what's legal? We do not build a society where we expect either companies or governments to act moral. We expect them to act legal. But we're now living in a world where legal can't keep up. So you have simple things. In the United States, email isn't subject to the same privacy laws as paper mail, or telephone records versus voice over IP. Right? The Stored Records Act, which was written for email, said that after email is protected with good process, but after 3 months it's considered abandoned. And that made a lot of sense until Gmail was invented, where your email is on the server for years. It made great sense when you were popping in, but now I do that and nobody else. And so what are the business trends? And I think these are important too. Companies are moving towards more control over users. I believe that the big computer companies like Microsoft realized what a huge mistake they made making Windows open, because they gave up so much control over their computer. And companies are not making the same mistake with the new computing platforms. Like the iPhone, the game machines, PDAs. If you look at Apple's control over the iPhone, it is much stronger than it has over its operating system or Microsoft has over Windows, over what is allowed on that platform. And they're keeping the Kindle. And you get updates, and you're not even allowed to say no. They just show up automatically without even telling you. And if you look at both Windows 8 and Apple's Mountain Lion, they're moving into that direction of greater vendor control. And there are lots of good business reasons why they want to do that. There's even lots of consumer reasons why it's a good idea. People don't want control. It's too scary. It's too hard. Someone else taking care of it is a great model. So you've got these closed computing platforms, and you've got the push to cloud computing. Again, your data on someone else's hard drive. So we as users are losing control over our data and the endpoints we use to access our data. And we're giving up that control for really good reasons. I mean, as consumers, my mother loves this. Right? She loses her phone, gets a new one, pushes a button, her data magically appears on the new phone. That's great. Right? Her photos are on whatever photo site she's using. She doesn't have to worry about losing them. I mean, there is consumer demand driving this. And there's also vendor demand pushing this. But the other business trend is this data has value. It has marketing value, personalization. I actually like it when Amazon tells me books I might want to read based on books I bought. I get a lot of good books that way. It has value in process streamlining and convenience. And it has value, we can argue how much, in security. And there is both a primary and a secondary market in this data. How much those markets are fueled depends on local laws, but the markets are there. Now, make no mistake, surveillance is the business model of the internet. I remember the quote earlier, right? If you don't know who the product is, it's you. Right? You're not Google's customer. I mean, I'm always amazed when people complain about Google's customer service. They actually have great customer service. Become a customer, you can use their customer service. As long as you're a user, you don't have access to it. Right? Products don't get customer service. All right. So technology and business together. I'm still really on the trends here. Identification provides easy security. It's a cheap substitute for authorization. Right? It facilitates audit, and it allows companies to judge people by their data. Right? It could be as benign as judging you in what ad to show you, or it could be as important as judging whether you should get a loan or not. Right? This allows these systems to scale. So there is this predilection towards identification systems. Someone asked in a talk, why does Facebook require real names? Because that way they can match it better with offline data. Right? It is more profitable for them to demand real names. That's why. Yes, it might harm the Chinese dissidents, but this is profit. This is important. Right? The trends are towards a phrase I like to use, wholesale surveillance, monitoring everybody. And it's not just surveillance in the future. Someone mentioned this in a talk earlier, I forget who. You can surveil people backwards in time. It's actually new in our society. You could surveil somebody 6 months ago, a year ago. And also something that's new, we're getting to a world where systems never forget. And I think this is going to be a massive social change. There's quite a lot of social lubricant in the fact that our memories suck. And if we're living in a world where nothing is ever ephemeral, I think it's going to be different in ways we cannot predict. I think this is going to be a big social change. And we have to think of this as the death of ephemeral conversation. Maybe where the whole world becomes like an airport security zone where you can't make a joke. All right, so business legal trends. There is an alliance of corporate and government interests here. I call it the public-private surveillance partnership. Right? It's interesting. Each uses the other's data. I mean, the NSA couldn't do all of this without the big companies who collect the data, who we give the data to. And they couldn't do this on their own. And that's what's interesting. And each one uses the other's law to get around its own restrictions. See this a lot in the United States. And, corporations use government rules to protect themselves, and the government uses corporate rules to get around its own restrictions. You see a bunch of examples of this. They hide behind each other's laws. We'll see U.S. companies not releasing perfectly reasonable information they don't want to release because they claim there's a national security interest. And it'll be things like companies polluting records because they give information about some kind of chemical plant, and therefore that's a potential terrorist target, therefore they can't release. And it's like each group is hacking each other's law. It's really interesting. And somebody needs to write that up. Someone who's more lawyerly than I. Right? NSA surveillance piggybacks on corporate capabilities. I think it's an important takeaway. It's something we haven't talked about today. But also something I wrote, I think, last week, and I should have wrote it months ago, but I didn't think of it then. A lot of talk about metadata. Metadata equals surveillance. Right? And the thought experiment is easy. If you hire a private detective to eavesdrop on somebody, what they would do is they would plant a room bug in their room, they would tap their phone, right? They would get the conversations. If you hired a private detective to put someone under surveillance, what would they do? They'd follow them around. They'd figure out who they talked to, where they went, what they looked at, what they bought. That's all metadata. Metadata equals surveillance. When the president says, the US president says, it's just metadata, what he's saying is, oh, you're just under constant surveillance, don't worry about it. That's what he's saying. Metadata equals surveillance. Do not think it's trivial. Right, so when we talk about privacy, we talk about security and privacy, we in the community have lots of definitions. But I think for most people, in the vernacular, privacy is very much about control. right? Control of information. It's not about secrecy. It's about control. Control of information, the information dissemination, the information usage, right? Control over our email, our text conversations, our files, our medical information, our bank information. Because when someone experiences a privacy failure, right, what they think is, how did they know that? How did I lose control of information? I only told that to my doctor. Why am I getting marketing information based on it? So how, it's very much about control. And this is where I think US law has problems, because we very much have a secrecy definition of privacy. It's, you have an expectation of privacy. And if you talk about it on email, you obviously lost that expectation. But you didn't. You spoke to this other person. And when I tell something to my doctor, yes, it's no longer secret, but I just don't expect him to publish it. So it's control over context. And we are a complex species, and we have many different distribution contexts of our information. Right? The facet of ourselves we have at work isn't the same facet we have when we're out with our friends or with our family at Christmas. And it's really, historically, I think the best example of this have been teachers. Right? They were always very, if you ever been walking with a young child and met his teacher on the street, sort of amazing to watch that person drop from normal person on the street context to teacher context. Right? Very different person. Not about secrecy, it's about difference. So in the United States, about 150 years ago, we actually had huge debates about whether teachers should be able to get married. And what this debate is people saying, I can't imagine the person teaching my child having sex. That's what it was, right? It's that massive context collision. That naturally, we are actually very good at keeping separate. But the technologies make that harder. It is much harder to keep those contexts separate in Facebook. Google tried with their circles. I don't even know how they work. But it's just not very easy. And that really makes privacy harder. And the way to think of this is that we're living in the world of complex socio-technical systems. Right? We are very, very good at dealing with evolved social systems. Every one of you knew exactly how to operate during lunch, talking to friends, talking to strangers. I mean, you were making constant privacy decisions. You just didn't realize it because we're so good at it. Right? As a species, we have evolved to do this really, really well. Right? But as computers mediate more of our interactions, that requires us to make explicit things that used to be ad hoc. Right? You ask any normal person, what's your privacy policy, they'll look at you like you're weird. Right? Yet they have one. And now they have to write it down. Right? And check some boxes. And make sure it's consistent. Make sure they follow it. Right? Computers make us have policy. That's not just privacy policy, it's your backup policy. Before computers, we all had a backup policy. We never thought of it, but we kind of did. Now we actually have to have a real one and follow it. So there's an enormous psychology of privacy decisions that suddenly becomes relevant here. I'm going to run through some of the research very quickly. Someone talked about, why, someone in this area asked a question about, people on Facebook don't care. Not that they don't care. They care dearly. Facebook tries really hard to make them not care. In privacy, salience matters. If you are thinking about it, it's important. If you are not thinking about it, it's not important. And there's some really interesting research. Turns out if you do a web survey and you put a long paragraph about how you're going to protect their privacy on top, it inhibits disclosure. Not because they don't believe you, because you're making them think about privacy. If you put up kind of a happy website that never mentions privacy and makes it all like fun, people will tell you anything. Right? So when Facebook puts up that box and says, we made a change in your privacy policy, click here if you want to see it, what they're saying is, annoying stuff, click here if you don't want to do what you came here to do. Of course no one's going to click on it. Right? You're on Facebook to talk to your friends, not to read a privacy policy. Right? So salience matters a lot. There's a privacy endowment effect. You know, people value it much more when they have it. Group behavior matters. If you believe your friends are sharing, you'll share more. Social norms matter. This is why a lot of the sites make a big deal that everybody's doing it, because you're more likely to put your pictures up if everybody's putting pictures up. Right? We have 2 billion tagged photos, whatever they say. That's to make you feel like you're being part of the group that's doing everything. Right? Perceived expectations matter. Privacy sensitivity is set locally. It's a great experiment where people are asked private questions and sort of increasing amounts of personal privacy. You know, pretty basic ones first, and then highly private last. And other people ask the same questions in the reverse order. And if you get people to answer the really private question first, everything else is easy. If you ratchet up, people eventually say, oh, that's too private. I mean, there's an illusion of control that's been documented. Right? Optimism bias, you know, why would they target me? I've got nothing to hide. There's an overconfidence. People believe there's greater legal protection than there is. And the result of all of this is basically people have inconsistent and conflicting beliefs on privacy. This is why it's so hard to get a privacy policy from anybody. I mean, you know, we're just unable to capture nonlinear privacy policies or contradictory privacy policies. And companies play on this. I mean, these sites are deliberately designed to reduce your inhibitions so that you share more, because that is valuable to them. I mean, they're not breaking the law. I mean, this is just basic psychological manipulation. It's perfectly legal. Right? And technology is going to make this worse. I mean, I think of technology as a disruptor. You know, there's some balance that we've achieved as society, and technology changes that balance somehow. Something becomes cheaper or more common or less effective. It gives one party more leverage. And, you know, Moore's law tends to be the friend of intrusive tools. It makes collection and storage cheaper. And it's interesting we're having a debate now, because I think might be our last chance, because most of this will fade into the background. I mean, already people are used to ID checks. In the United States, where, you know, 30, 40 years ago it was abhorrent. Now it's normal. But in another 10 years, the ID check will be obsolete because they're going to know who you are when you walk up to them. It's being broadcasted by your devices, they recognize your face, whatever reason. Right? You know, we're living in the world where the cameras are everywhere and we can still see them. 10 years ago they weren't everywhere. In 10 years we won't be able to see them anymore. Right? ID cards will disappear. Data mining becomes more advanced. The Internet of Things means there are going to be sensors everywhere. We haven't even begun to discuss that. And the data storage requirements to save this all isn't unrealistic. I just ran some numbers. Typical Internet user is about 4 to 8 gigabytes a year, saving everything. Recording every phone conversation for a person, I'm figuring 500 minutes a month is about 5 gigabytes a year, and not even doing voice to text. You do voice to text and just save the words you don't recognize, suddenly it becomes a lot cheaper. And then the next step is going to be life recorders, right, the Google Glass sort of things. Right, video is going to be, I think, about 700 gigabytes a year compressed. And then we're going to live in the world where it'll be suspicious not to have one. I've already seen a court case where the fact that the defendant didn't have his phone with him was used as evidence that he didn't want to be tracked. Right. Ask me later and I'll get you the data. Right, and this is important. It's never just one thing. A lot of the debate we have is always about this program or that program. And that, I think, is very wrong. It's everything together. It's not just drones. It's drones plus face recognition plus Facebook's tagged photo database. Right? It's Verizon metadata plus cell phone surveillance plus data mining techniques plus internet monitoring. It's everything together. One of the lessons of all these NSA leaks is that surveillance is robust. If the NSA ever had a choice, should we do A or B? They did both. This is what happens when you have a big budget. And the debate really needs to talk about the limitations of intelligence. I did an essay, I think it appeared last week or the week before. It turns out that the US had a 3-day notice that Syria was going to use chemical weapons on its people. Right? Through intelligence. And we didn't do anything. There are a bunch of reasons why this could be so. One, it only became obvious after the fact, right? We had the data, but didn't have the information. Two, we weren't sure, right? We had the information we thought, but maybe it wasn't true. Three, we were sure, but we couldn't do anything. Like, what could we do now that we have the data? We can't, preemptively bomb them, so we're stuck just knowing this. And four, and this is the most interesting one, that we knew it, we could do something, but chose not to because that would reveal sources and methods. If you are in charge of collecting data, you measure your success by amount of data collected. And it seems like there's not enough discussion about the value of collecting it, the value of the information, whether it's a good idea, whether the costs are greater than the benefits. Right? Breaking into the Belgian phone company was fun, but was it worth it? Probably not. We've seen nothing resembling a cost-benefit analysis out of any NSA program. But there's no surprise. There's nothing out of the TSA either. And that's the sort of thing you'd expect. Right? Is this worth it? General Alexander, just a couple of days ago at a U.S. hearing, said that this data was valuable. And the question really to ask is, how valuable was it? Right? If a data program costs, and I'm just going to make these numbers up, $100 million, and hiring a new FBI agent costs $100,000, is the data worth 1,000 FBI agents? Is it? Is it not? That's the question. But you just never see these cost-benefit analyses. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this run amok. It's true for corporate data as well. There's a lot written about how big data and data mining isn't really as good as everyone thinks it is right now. That you have an enormous diminishing returns. Nicholas Taleb talks about this very eloquently, that you just get too much data, and you see patterns where there aren't any. Now, I think we need to reject this whole security versus privacy debate. Very much a false dichotomy. First, it's not true that security is always in opposition to privacy. Only identity-based security hurts privacy. When someone says security versus privacy to you, look at them and say, offense. A door lock. There are no privacy implications to these things. Very limited security affects privacy. Now, I've said for years there have been 2 improvements to airline security, only 2 since 9/11. First one is reinforcing the cockpit door. The second one is convincing passengers they need to fight back. Everything else has been a waste of money. Right? So ID cards affect privacy, burglar alarms don't. God, I remember a few months after 9/11, I was on a show called Diane Reams. It's a radio show in the United States. And I was there with some, I guess it might have been a DHS person, and so it might have been after the DHS was formed. And that person said, when you're sitting on an airplane, you want to know the identity of the person sitting next to you. And I said, well, no, I don't. I just want to know if he's going to blow up the airplane. If he's not going to blow up the airplane, I don't care who he is. And honestly, if he is going to blow up the airplane, I don't care who he is either. Right? Identity is completely irrelevant to what I want. What I want is actual security. Right? This isn't new. Right? Privacy has enormous value. And a lot of us here, I've been asked again and again how to justify privacy. I was asked that in an interview like an hour ago on that table. What is the value of privacy? It has enormous social value, and I think we need to start articulating it better. Right? It is a fundamental human need. It's not about something to hide. It's about human dignity. It protects us from those in power. You know, and lack of privacy changes things. I mean, I have noticed my own conversations change since I believed I was targeted by the government. You know, and not just conversations about things the government might be targeting on, conversations in general. Right, this is fundamentally a liberty versus control debate, and the way to think of it is in terms of power. Right, privacy increases power. Right, so when you have, so forced openness in government, right, decreases government power, increases liberty. Forced openness in people decreases individual power and decreases liberty. Right, it's not a matter of you know, I know your secrets, you know my secrets, therefore it's even. Because of the power differential. When you go to a doctor, the doctor says, take off your clothes, you can't say, you first, doc. Right? When a policeman asks for your ID, if you see the policeman's ID, it doesn't make it somehow balanced. Right? The power differential is what matters here. Right? So that's why mutual disclosure doesn't work. We want to reduce power imbalances. And so security is fundamentally liberty plus privacy. Right? So it's things we've heard about in some of the European laws. Human rights, privacy rights, open government laws. And again, the very aspects of computers that make crime such a problem make it very easy to trample rights. Governments do it, corporations do it. And there's a great quote from Bill Binney that I'm going to use where he says that we are like this far from a turnkey totalitarian state. What he's saying is the technology puts us there. But we know how to deal with it. We actually know how to deal with this. When privacy and security are in opposition, we have solutions. Right? We all willingly give up a lot of privacy in the name of security. We give the police the ability to intrude on our privacy, and to a surprisingly high degree, because we know we need that to give them the ability to solve crimes. So police investigations, sharing of medical information, a lot of identification in a corporate setting. And what we do when we want privacy, when we know that privacy has to be violated, transparency and oversight is how we maintain security. Right? It's true for government, it's true for corporations. Right? Think of the warrant process. This is how we monitor for police abuses. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's how it works. And there's never going to be a perfect solution here. I think it's going to be a patchwork, but transparency and accountability are how we're going to do it. Right, there's a lot of talk about the death of privacy. We heard quotes from Mort Zuckerberg and Eric Schmidt, and Larry Ellison has said stuff. Death of privacy has sort of always been a big seller. You can read about when the camera was invented, when the audio recorder was invented, when the video recorder was invented, the internet. There's some great books you can read. 2005, Robert R. Harrow, No Place to Hide. 2000, Simpson Garfinkel, Database Nation. 1998, David Brin, The Transparent Society. Way back 1969, Jerry Rosenberg wrote a great book called The Death of Privacy. Right, this is not new. And I think it's overrated. I mean, just because cameras exist, it doesn't follow that taking pictures of everybody naked is inevitable. Right? It's the death of privacy because corporate and government power is killing it. So while I don't think it's inevitable, it is natural. It's natural as to where the technology flows. And privacy has always been a balancing act. The internet changes that balance, but we get to change it as well. Right? We can either accept the balance that technology gives us, or, like most other things in our world, We handle it through law, through rules. Right? So now the question is, who makes the rules? Right? I mean, technology determines what's possible. Law determines what's legal. The market determines what options people have. So, we have actually very little control. Right? Because remember what's going on. You have complex socio-technical systems. You have users who are generally not customers. You have very deliberate psychological manipulation as to what's going on. I mean, when we're actually in a crap position to do something, the best place we have to deal with this is law. And this is not easy. I mean, yes, this is complicated. I know I don't think it'll be done in a year. But it is actually the only solution we have. And it's the comprehensive privacy laws we always talk about, and technological controls to support the laws. And we actually can build privacy into systems, but those are only solutions after there's a legal regime. It's actually very hard to find technological solutions to this problem, because fundamentally it is a political and social problem. I wrote an essay where I gave a bunch of tips on how to stay secure despite the NSA. The tips are crap, because most people can't do them. I mean, you don't want tips that, a few people can do. You want tips that my mother can handle. And she's protected largely by law. I mean, the way to think of this is very much like the pollution problem. Data is the pollution of the information society. And I think it's a really robust analog, right? All processes produce it. It stays around. And we're arguing about how to deal with it. We're arguing about the recycling. We're arguing about the, how it's disposed of. We're arguing about the secondary uses. And I actually believe that just like we look back 100 years ago and sort of amazed at how the titans of industry built up the industrial age and completely disregarded everything about pollution, that in 4 generations they're going to look back at us and marvel of how we completely discarded information pollution in our rush to build the information age. And it might very well be that it'll take 60 years before we as a society realize how bad it is and clean it up. My hope is it'll take a generation, but I actually don't think it'll happen quicker than this. I think fundamentally the people in power, the people who brag that they don't use email, need to retire. Right? And the people who grew up on the internet need to be in power. And that will be an enormous social change, which will allow us to look at these problems very differently. Right? When people are scared, they'll do anything not to be scared. And a lot of what the NSA has done has been a response to personal and institutional fear. Right? And that's why it's so robust. That's why the laws either don't work or have been hastily rewritten to support it. But we can get over this. The quote that keeps you from being completely depressed is from Martin Luther King, where he said, "The arc of history is long when it bends towards justice." It might take 50 years, but we've gotten over this stuff in the past. In the United States, we got over the Red Scare. Took a while, but we did. Now I believe we will figure this out. I don't think it'll be soon. In a lot of cases, what I think we're doing is figuring out how to lose less. How to make these interim years less bad. Because I don't think, in the United States, there's not the political will to fix this. There just isn't. Maybe we can do some stuff around the edges. But eventually there will be the political will to fix it, and eventually we'll fix it. So that's what I have prepared. I'm happy to take questions. Kind of ignored all the tech, so I can answer tech questions tech questions now. There are 2 microphones here, but your guys are all over there, so there's got to be some mechanism to get those closer to you. I know, I will miss it and hit the person behind you, and that'll just be bad. Yeah, we don't have working microphones here. We consider it a security threat.
So thanks for a great talk, Bruce. So 2 questions, very specific and more general.
Let's do one at a time, because I'll forget the first when you ask the second.
Okay, so the specific one is, now you've had a look at the Snowden documents, is there anything in there directly implicating PGP or GPG that has been something we should know about? And the second question is...
Let me do the first.
Yeah.
I have not seen anything. In general, I believe the math is robust. And I think that's the main story of the NSA breaking all the crypto. So I know no new facts. So I believe there is at least one cryptographical thing that the NSA has that we don't, because they're crowing about it so much. And my guesses are, in order of likelihood, clever stuff on elliptic curves that allows them to break a class of them, where if they can influence the curves we use, they have an edge, which I believe they've done. General techniques on factoring discrete logs, which seems perfectly plausible they have, or RC4, which is, for those who don't know, is a symmetric cipher that RSA uses and is in a bunch of internet protocols. So those are the 3 things, if I was guessing, but I'm just guessing here. Other than that, I believe they break a lot of crypto. They believe they mostly do that by hacking around the crypto. So it's weakening random number generators. Random number generators are lousy. Right? I mean, the research you did on RSA moduli. I mean, there's just a lot of bad randomness out there. Deliberately going in and getting keys, compromising root certificates. So, I mean, going through the implementations is where I believe most of the benefit is. Because even if you have, I mean, I'm sure they have academic breaks against AES that we don't. But to get that down to reading operational traffic, anything resembling human time, is extraordinary. So my guess, and Snowden said this in his first interview, the math is that properly implemented cryptography is good, but it's really hard to do it cryptography. The way I say it is, the math is great, but the math has no agency. And to get from the math to a computer program that protects your data is a lot of steps, and all those steps are vulnerable. Question 2.
So the second question is more general, and I guess from what you say about when you have a computer, it's kind of easier to record data than to throw it away. You've actually got to do extra work to throw it away. And I guess from someone who's from the perspective of liking the idea of European data protection law in general, way back in 1998, we had a directive which was supposed to ensure the erasure of metadata. So, of course, the system, the legal system in the US is the dominant legal system, the dominant paradigm on the internet, because it's such a US-dominated place. But I guess from a European perspective, we don't see things in quite those technological determinist terms. I mean, I guess what we need is regulators who understand the technology and have the guts to enforce it. Because, in a sense, if regulators in Europe had gone back, you know, if we go back a decade or more, if they had insisted on a growth of a European internet economy where the norms were European, where the metadata didn't get recorded all the time, because we're to some extent talking about defaults, right? The defaults on a log file. The default in a log file can be you process this stuff transiently and you throw it away. You don't write it to disk.
Right.
So a lot of this technological determinism I think we heard today from you, we don't see it maybe quite the same way. We see it more like a US-dominated industry and growth of an internet where our regulators, for whatever reason, there's a combination of reasons, don't seem to have had the guts to apply legal norms we've had for a very long time.
So there are some good points there. I think we do, one of the huge problems we have is we don't have technologists involved in legislation. I mean, so rarely someone who understands technology involved in regulating technology. And you know, when you have technologists, they're kind of these fake attorney technologists, apologies to Axel, they pretend to be technologists, but they're not, and you've met them, you know what they're like. So yes. as to whether the data retention is natural, the data production is natural. Right? We decide whether to save it or not. In the world of no regulation at all, because the marginal value, because the cost of saving is so cheap, you need so little marginal value, like it might become valuable in 10 years, we don't know why, you're going to save it.
Let me come back to you, because I mean, the legal theorists of data protection, going back to certainly the 80s and the 90s, they foresaw this problem. And it's only in a deregulationist-dominated paradigm that you get this problem.
Agreed.
And, you know, of course, one can't wish to go back 14 years and have a development of the European industry like we didn't have. But I'm more optimistic, I think, maybe than you, that the shock of Snowden can actually lead to Brazil and maybe Europe developing not just its own infrastructures, but also having legal norms which are different from the US and sticking to them.
And I would like that. I mean, I think, you know, Europe can do a lot to push the US. Certainly denying US business will make a huge difference. I mean, we are seeing cracks in that private-public security partnership. Companies like Facebook and Microsoft are really pissed off that they are being tarred with this NSA brush, and good. So if there could be European laws with teeth, where US companies are losing business, then I think we are going to see political change. Because right now it's weirdos like me who care about this. And you know, for most people this is not an issue. You know, I wish that were not true. But for most people this is an issue. And it will, I think it will take the business and government partnership to fracture even more. You know, the telcos aren't feeling this. You know, for some reason they've ducked a lot of this. It would be great if they didn't. Who has the next microphone?
Yeah, maybe a more laid-back question. You said you would hope to solve this problem in one generation, so let's assume the teens, so people who now are teenagers would be an important part of the solution. So we as teens or as young people, even elder ones, we want to be part of it. We want to use Facebook, want to have fun with friends, share love. What would be your take-home message for, I don't know, kids or friends or family to somehow continue on your sex analogy with your teacher? How do you teach them to slip on a virtual condom when they go online? Because they will go online, so how do you make that?
So all the research I've seen say that young people are actually very savvy about privacy online. And there are things they don't get. They tend not to care about governments and more care about people they're closer to, their friends, their parents, their teachers. But they are very good at managing their own privacy. I mean, despite that Facebook makes it hard. And the strategies, I think, are ingenious in some cases. Right? I mean, wall scrubbing is surprisingly frequent, where people just will delete their posts after a couple of days. And so I think these solutions will come out organically. I mean, I don't think you can force people who are sort of too young to be politically aware to become politically aware. I think people will reach that naturally. But, you know, I mean, I think the outrage at this point is good. So anything we can do to educate, I think will help in the long run. Whether it helps in the short run, we'll see. I mean, there is an anti-Facebook movement out there. It's small. And, you know, and Facebook's not going to, I think too much there's always too much focus on the individual companies. The companies come and go. Right? Facebook is big now, but it probably won't be in 5 years. It'll be something else. I mean, who knows what it is. But it'll be the same stuff. The data is going to flow from one to the other. It's not going to disappear. So the matter less who the companies are and more what the corporate practice is. But, you know, I think just general awareness is what's needed. And I don't really have a good answer. I'm not an ethnographer about teens and privacy. A lot of great ones out there. Dana Boyd, Sherry Tuckle. Those are the people to read. There was a hand over there. There it was. You have no microphone.
It works. Okay, so another techie question. What do you make of RSA's justification for their use of dual ECD RBG?
So this is a weird one. So the general, so this is a random number generator. The general question is, we know that the NSA has deliberately weaken cryptography of commercial products. We know that this is one of their tactics. The obvious next question is, okay, which ones? And we don't know. I'm actually writing an essay on this right now, which hopefully will release in a few days, on sort of what the metrics would be if you were the NSA on what you would want to subvert and how you'd want to subvert it. This random number generator is a weird one. It doesn't make a lot of sense mathematically. It has some magic numbers in it, which in theory could be a backdoor, we don't know. I mean, there's arguments for and against there being a backdoor here. The arguments for is that it was pushed into the government standard, that it was made a default for reasons we're not sure yet, but I know someone who's working on it. The reasons that are against are like it's like too flippant obvious, and they would want to be more subtle than that. I don't know. I mean, I think moving away from it is just a safe move at this point. And right now there's a lot of mistrust in the security community of U.S. government standards, just period, because we don't know what's tainted. And I think this is the biggest crime, shame of that whole bull run disclosure, is that the trust of the internet was just sort of sucked out. That now we know we don't know what to trust. Is this good as, I mean, you asked me about PGP. Is it good as not? We don't know. Can I trust Microsoft's BitLocker? Can I trust the random number generator in Intel chips? We have no idea. And now when we don't know anything, conspiracy theories take hold. Right? And the thing about conspiracy theories in this area is too many of them turn out to be true in the end. Right? So now we have good reason to believe conspiracy theories. So, I mean, things I think are getting very bad because we just don't know what to trust. And I'm hoping we can come up with some guidelines, and I'm trying to write up some of those, and hopefully there'll be some discussion on sort of what we can do. Although, in some ways, I think this whole discussion is besides the point. Right? And if we figure out what we can trust today, we're solving yesterday's problem. To solve tomorrow's problem, we need to figure out how to design systems that we know we can trust them. And I think that's the more important thing we need to figure out. Don't have an answer there, but that's where I think we should start looking. See a hand there. And that's it. Wave wildly if you're another hand.
The amount of money to...
Who's talking?
Me.
Oh, hi.
The amount of money that's spent to NSA is very much. It's terrible, but the result is very low. He says, okay, they describe 10 terrorist attacks like that, but the ratio between the cost and the effect is terrible. And if you go to like classical spying with human, you make human make the works, it's much better. It is not the limit of the technology. They use a lot of technology, but the result is not good.
Right. I agree. Yeah, I mean, an argument.
Yes, I have a question concerning cost analysis. You mentioned that during your talk. And I'm not entirely sure whether you propose that as a solution to make the work of intelligence agencies better, or if you simply gave that as an example of their state of mind. But I wonder how far cost analysis can bring this debate, because you gave the analogy of data to pollution, and in fact in the debate about ecology there is really this question about how to do cost analysis. And there is, for example, this example I'm thinking about where there was this cost analysis about whether logging should be allowed in national parks in the United States. And the cost analysis that was made included the cost of building the roads to the sites where trees would be felled, but not the actual value of the nature being destroyed. My question is, do you think we understand enough about the costs of privacy violation to be able to even propose cost analysis as a solution for this debate?
So I think we know enough to be able to propose it. I mean, yes, you're right. The devil's going to be in the details, and ecology is a great example. I mean, a lot of costs are externalized, so they don't fall into people's equations. But I think unless we even start cost analysis, we're not going to be able to have intelligent conversations about what we should or shouldn't do. Right? The belief in the United States is more intelligence is better. Right? That's the belief. And there's never a discussion of, well, maybe this is too much intelligence. And maybe, getting all this data isn't worth it. But until you start having that conversation, we'll never get to the point where we can say, hey, look, we didn't include that cost, or you're overstating that benefit. And even the TSA is probably an even easier place to start. Right? We know the costs of full-body scanners. Well, what are the benefits? And let's do the math. John Mueller has done some great work with TSA security and looked at cost-benefit. And he's the one who has math that shows reinforcing the cockpit door makes sense. And you could justify that on cost versus benefits. And taking off your shoes just doesn't. Right? But you have, and you can take his analysis and you can argue with it, but at least there's something to argue with. For NSA intelligence gathering, we don't even have anything to argue with. Right? I expect, like every other government program in the United States, that these be subjected to cost-benefit analysis. That seems only fair. I'm reminded, this has nothing to do with you, but there's a clever tactic being done in the U.S. right now. EPIC is doing this. That it turns out there's a law in the United States that says that any major government program that affects a substantial number of people needs to be subject to a public comment period. And there's no exemption in this law for defense. So the NSA, so EPIC is suing the NSA. They didn't follow this public comment period law. Now, it's probably not going to go anywhere, but it's just, it's kind of interesting to see how these programs just believe they are just exempt from everything, without even thinking about it. No, that doesn't apply to us. Didn't say that doesn't apply to you. Sorry, just reminded me of that.
Final question.
Final question.
So I'm an American. I was born in America. I now basically live in exile in Europe, self-imposed, but for good reason, I think. And I'm curious, are you also horrified as well as embarrassed by how the United States treats us as people, but everyone else in this room as if they do not exist in any sense? Like, we care about Americans being spied on, but most of the debate suggests that Aryan, for example, is not a human being. Like, I'm really embarrassed by this, but I wonder, how can you talk to government officials that say that kind of stuff, and how do you handle that, and what do you think?
So I think it is embarrassing, but remember, we are living very much in a world where if it's legal, it's okay, even though it's immoral. I mean, that's the fundamentals of our market economy. That's the fundamentals of this law. And even worse, even if it's illegal, it's okay if you don't get caught. Right? So yes, this is definitely immoral. But that's a huge problem with the way our society is put together. I find that when I'm writing essays, and I'm writing to an American audience, I have to couch it in Americans and American effects, because otherwise people don't listen. That this notion that non-U.S. citizens are somehow lesser is surprisingly pervasive, and not just inside the NSA or inside government. That congressman from wherever he was from, who is from Texas, right? That's Texas. That's not him. Right? Americans don't have passports. There's the U.S. and there's like the rest of the world. So this is hard. The more we, if that ACLU attorney came back with that human rights convention and argument back to that congressman, he would have been smeared for it. You almost can't make those arguments because it is so contrary to the way Americans think. And yes, this is bad, and I don't have a good answer. But my guess is the moral change will come even slower than the change of practices because they affect American business. If I can make an American business argument, I'm more likely to get change than if I make a world morality argument. But that's just the way our system is built. Even without the NSA, you talk to Facebook, they would say the exact same stuff. It's not illegal, therefore it's okay. Right? That piece of reasoning fundamentally makes no sense, but it is how our economic system is built. So yes, I am appalled, but it's a huge problem, and I often skirt it, because if I hit it head on, I lose my audience. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.